3 as opposed to sign of the 4. So it's Larry Solom, Earl Maltz, and I.
So I just have a question about the idea that your subject is actually constituent authority as opposed to something else. And so here's the definition you have early in the paper. I refer to that quality in a person or persons that enables them to produce an effective positive law constitution. So the first thing I would say about that is that I think it's a mistake to believe that there is any quality in a person or persons that it accounts for effective constitutions, because whether or not the Constitution will be law, will be authoritative, depends not on any quality in the person who writes it or attempts to institute it. It depends on the social facts that obtain, as we try to get the Constitution going. So you can have perfectly authoritative people with all of the qualities you describe as giving them this ability, who just fail because circumstances are such that the Constitution doesn't get uptake as law. And likewise, you can have people whose apparent authority would be completely illegitimate, right? But the Constitution will fail because it will succeed, right? Because it successfully provides a coordination point. So it seems to me that there's an assumption in this definition that's incorrect. And the second thing I'd like to say is just that it seems to me that you don't have, that there's not really a conception of authority in the paper that I recognize, right? So there are various theories of what authority is, but on a Razian theory or the theory that for it to be authority, it has to provide content-independent reasons for action, it's not clear that the person who institutes a legal order can have authority. It's sort of like that is a matter of social fact, right? And not a matter of authority. You sort of end up with a infinite regress problem if you try to have an authority that institutes a legal regime. Authority comes in at this later stage. So I would like to suggest that what you're really talking about is some conception of constitutional legitimacy, and that authority is not really the appropriate concept for this paper.
My, again, very interesting paper and presentation, but my issues are a little bit different. I think that Rick appeals to the idea of constituent authority for our Constitution, appeals to a myth, which is that it was formed by that the authority for forming the Constitution came from the people, when there's nothing in the framing that even suggests that the authority came from the people, except very indirectly, that it's very clear that the authority to form the Constitution was from the states, that the states formed the Constitution, and I could go through it. They voted as states at the convention. The state governments decided who was going to vote to, they ratified it as states. The state governments decided who was going to be in the ratification. And so, so if legitimacy stems from the people, the Constitution, I suppose, is from formation by the people. I suppose that makes it illegitimate, but that doesn't bother me. I think that we have to begin with the assumption that it is legitimate in a certain sense, but it seems to me that might have implications for originalist theory, in that the other thing about the formation of the Constitution is that it is not fundamentally different in that regard from the voting on statutes. That is, the people don't vote on statutes, that the that particular representatives have authority to vote on statutes. So that suggests to me that the same view of originalism that why we have originalist interpretation of statutes is the same thing. We should have originalist interpretation of constitutions, not because they come from the people. I hope that wasn't completely incoherent. Probably only partially.
Here's a comment. Larry Sullivan said something close to what I was going to say. I've known Rick for a long, long time. One of the virtues of being old is that you've known certain things for a long, long time. And Rick, early on, wrote an extremely good article on the rule of recognition. I can't even remember what the title was, but this is a continue. This article today is
it's the same old song.
Same old, this pretty much we all sing the same old songs, and it seems so. If you think about this in terms of a rule of recognition, the rule that recognizes that piece of parchment in the National Archives as the fundamental law of the land, and that of course always rests on contemporary acceptance, and so we can accept now that shall be a sort of content-independent source of reasons for us to act in various ways. And one of the things that makes constitutions quite stable, it seems to me, and this is alluded to here, is just if my willingness to accept something as authoritative, as to settling what I ought to do, depends to some extent on how effective it's going to be, how many other people are going to recognize it in the same way, and thus, to pick up a point that John McGinnis said, but it's not a question of how difficult it is to get together and change it. It's basically, I'm going to only accept this if enough other people are accepting it to make it, a viable rule of settlement for me. It means, for example, that the notion of constituent authority is, there's an ambiguity here, because it is possible on the sort of Hartian analysis and so forth to have different constitutions ruling in the same territory. You have different groups of people accepting, the Free French or the partisans accepting a different rule of recognition from Vichy, occupying the same territory. Now, it's not a happy circumstance necessarily. It's not. It's more of a pathological one, but it's surely possible. And now, there was a wonderful little book, an anthology to which Fred Schauer contributed, and he had a piece called "Amending the Presuppositions of the Constitution." And the question was sort of, how many times has the Constitution been amended? And of course, you can go and count the formal amendments, but Fred's point was, well, if we have come to accept deviations from the intended meaning of the document, and we've accepted them as the supreme law of the land, then we have had these non-organic amendments alongside the organic ones that have, that appear. And now, one of the questions always, to some extent, it's an empirical question. What have people accepted? What do they accept? Part of it depends what you think people know, not just about the process by which it's found, but what the Supreme Court has done. Is Roe versus Wade in the Constitution? And it seems to me it's sort of an interesting sociological question. Do people accept Roe versus Wade because they think the Supreme Court was doing a certain thing, or do they accept it for some other reason? If they were told that the Supreme Court made it up, would they still accept it? Don't know the answer to those questions. Those questions seem to be for me, the germane questions, right? What is the supreme law of land? And of course, non-originalists have this idea. It's, leaving aside Supreme Court precedents that got things wrong. They have the idea that there's the parchment that's in the National Archives. It's like an object there. But, you can read it as if, this is David A.J. Richards at NYU. Read it as if it had been written by John Rawls. Pick your favorite, person. And so they have this sort of odd view that, they're, and I think most non-originalists sort of fall into one of, it's sort of, there's some marks on a page. Let's read them, as if they had been written by someone other than those who actually wrote them. In any event, it seems to me this is a sort of rule of recognition thing, and it doesn't, sort of the people, the constituent authority seem to be the people who accept the same rule, and they could be big or small. Okay, we got time. We're going to have responses. And then.
I'm not sure how to respond to most of this stuff. The three questions. I want to talk about what John said also, but the three questions seem to me all kind of have something in common, in that what I'm talking about here is, as I hope I make clear, is not the identification of an authority which can be identified and validated at the moment of the exercise of the lawmaking power. Maybe that disqualifies it in some way from being called authority. I don't know who if we have an academy which tells us what we can call authority and what we can't. But the point of it is that it's kind of a retrospective construction. As with the rule of recognition, how do you? The rule? Nobody legislates a rule of recognition. A rule of recognition is only recognized after the fact. And I think constituent authority is that also. That is, we look at a certain series of events and we say, aha, this Constitution being the product of this set of human events seems to us, therefore, to be worthy of our submission to it. So I don't mean by authority kind of an ex ante quality you can't know until nothing succeeds like success. As Hart, as among others, have said. So I guess that's sort of what I'd say to Larry Solom is I'm sorry if I'm misusing the term authority, but I think in fact it captures something of what people now see in historical events. And so I just say about, and I would say the same thing really to what Earl said. That is, the people as a constituent authority in the United States is not a matter of what the people actually did in 1787-89, whoever the people are. It is rather what at various points in time, and I think in regard to the Constitution, actually fairly soon after the Constitution, people began to think of the validity of the Constitution as a manifestation of its creation by the people. Indeed, at the Constitutional Convention, when they're debating a ratification, and I wrote something about this a long time ago, the legality of creating a new constitution, they say the authority of the people can do anything. We don't have to worry about the rules of the Constitution because the authority can blot out, the people may blot out all legal irregularity. And in this idea of whether it's the states or the people is in fact, of course, a theme in constitutional history, almost from the moment of ratification until well after the Civil War, maybe right up to Reagan's inauguration address, in which he restored the constituent role of the states. I'm sorry if I've slighted some of the other points that were made. I do want to say something about what John said, which I'm almost all in agreement with. That is, it certainly is true that the exercise a fresh exercise of constitution making has to arise from dissatisfaction with an existing constitutional regime, and the dissatisfaction will almost always be stimulated in the first instance, not by any worry about the legitimacy of the constitution-making process, but by some substantive defect in the constitutional rules. I say nobody ever made a revolution just on the basis of constitutional principles. You make a revolution because something substantively bad is happening. But when in fact the substantive dissatisfaction pinches, then one is going to in fact re-examine the nature of the Constitution itself. So we'll say, yes, the Constitution is bearing down on me. I hate not being able to get a drink, they might have said after the 18th Amendment. But, it's the Constitution, and those guys knew what they were doing, and it's all done the right way. And so there's got to be a level of substantive dissatisfaction sufficient to overcome our attachment to the authority that we attribute to the Constitution-making process. And again, I'm sure people noticed when John was talking about this is essentially what the Declaration of Independence says, and all experience hath shown that mankind will suffer while evils are sufferable, rather than to overturn those forms to which they have become accustomed. To the extent that we have a substantively good Constitution, we don't have to worry about the constituent authority. It's only when, in fact, we have a Constitution, and it goes the other way. That is, say we can have a very. I think somebody mentioned this. We could have a very a crummy process that creates a very good Constitution, right? And then I assume people won't worry about it. Because these abstractions only become relevant once we've decided something needs to be done.
Okay, we now have a second triad: Mike Rappaport, Kurt Lash, and Bernie Myler. Mike.
So I very much enjoyed the paper. It was very rich. Learned a lot. Lots of people I hadn't heard of in there. So very much enjoyed it. So these comments, I don't know if they come across as kind of obvious points, or I'll sound a bit like a crit or an anti-originalist or whatever. But not necessarily. At the end, you talk about the acceptance then of a constitution will depend on two things: the perceived legitimacy of the source of the Constitution and the desirability of its provisions. Just trying to, when I was thinking this through and thinking about the United States Constitution, it's just how significant it is that so much seems to be based on myth. And you talk about that, and just sort of how much of the sort of American core ideas, let's say, of the common person, right? So we the people, well, whether it's we the states, we the people in the states, as Earl says, or we the people, well, obviously it's not we the people, and I mean there are no blacks who are involved. There are no women. There are some, although limited, property restrictions, and so. Of course, we don't think about it that way any longer, right? It doesn't come up sort of here. Now, in part, that's because it's all been corrected, so it's been changed later on. But there's a tendency to go back and to just read those words, read the people, and to think, yes, this was an exercise of popular sovereignty. Now, admittedly, it was by historical standards very important. I think the Constitution would be a much worse document for not having had the significant popular aspects to it. But there is this very significant myth aspect to it. And then when we talk about the current rules, I think every originalist has got to admit that the current rules are very much a departure from originalism. right? And so that's both sort of talks about the, I guess, the source of the existing rules, the constitutional law, as well as their desirability, right? So for the average person, they seemingly the Supreme Court is enforcing the Constitution, but of course it's not. So it just, when you start to apply the analysis to the American context, one of the virtues of the paper, at least for me, was to focus in on something that's often forgotten. John and I have tried to focus in on it in our own work, but just how much of a kind of myth there is in the American constitutional law, I guess.
Kurt?
I thought it was a great paper, and again, it got me thinking about my own ideas of popular sovereignty and placing them in a broader context. But of course, popular sovereignty is only part of what you're trying to talk about. You're doing the general subject of constituent authority, and so one place I wanted to go with it is thinking about the implications of your paper in terms of the proper role of the court in maintaining the stability or longevity of a constitutional regime. There seems to be this idea that for a stable and long-lasting constitutional government, there has to be some kind of legitimacy, some type of acceptance, some type of social fact of veneration of the founding of that original organic moment. Popular sovereignty and this idea that there was a moment of self-government is one kind of social fact. One way to create that veneration, one way to create people's acceptance and long-standing acceptance of the Constitution. It doesn't have to operate that way. It wouldn't be that way in Japan, post-World War II Japan or Germany. But in American practice, it would be an act of popular sovereignty. And I think that has implications for what the role of the court should be and what methods of interpretation are going to have a stabilizing or destabilizing effect in a constitutional system such as ours, which is based upon that kind of vision of constituent authority. So, for example, the New Deal. Most of us, when you teach constitutional law, there's a dramatic change in the thrust of the court's interpretation of the Constitution. Maybe it happens over 3 decades, maybe it happens within 5 years, but there's a change. And the court doesn't explain the change as an exercise of constituent authority. It doesn't say, we are here as representatives of the people and we're going to change what the Constitution is. No. They explain it according to the myth. The myth of what we're doing is we're restoring John Marshall. We're restoring the original vision of the Constitution, what Bruce Ackerman calls it, the myth of restoration or something along those lines. But they point back to it because there's a recognition that their legitimacy, their authority to speak, what the law is, requires them to point back to an original organic moment. That's where their authority comes from. So even in the dramatic times and under the economic pressures of the New Deal, there still was that we need to couch this as an act of the people themselves and as an enforcement of the people themselves. So it just got me thinking, under the practice of American constitutional government, doesn't your work have implications for how the court goes about explaining what it does, its choice of interpretive methodology, and how its choice of interpretive methodology can have a stabilizing or destabilizing effect, and in the long run actually affect the longevity of constitutional government.
Bernie.
So I thought this was really fascinating, and my question really has to do with trying to figure out exactly the respective place of the substantive acceptance of the Constitution and acceptance of its mode of formation. Because in the comments that you just made, it seemed like, in a sense, the formation of the Constitution is a backstop if there's substantive disagreement about what it should be. But then I was wondering if there might also be a reverse of that, because I can imagine a certain moment, say we decided that we the people was no longer a good way to come about, with constitutions or to ground legitimacy. Or maybe more plausibly, if, in a society going from monarchy to something else, that you might say, well, there is an agreement about the substantive provisions, but yet we think that the authority by which they were given was not legitimate. So how does that work in your system?
Okay, Rick.
As to what both Mike and Kurt said about the myth and so on, you're absolutely right. And one of the things that I kind of had to confront in writing the paper, as the end of the paper suggests, is how much of the legitimacy of what we do in the name of the Constitution is based on a current perception of historical events that, in fact, is not faithful to actual historical events. As I said at the end of my presentation, I kind of don't see any way to avoid that. It's with what both of you said, and especially what Kurt was saying. It is interesting, of course, that the Supreme Court, when it adjudicates, for all of our, people's talk about, the limited effectiveness of originalism and so forth, the Supreme Court, every member of it, engages in originalist methods. And you kind of think they do so because they think that they have to ground the exercise of power in a legitimate source, which is in the which starts in the original creation of the Constitution. So now they do this without kind of a critical exam. None of them ever says, but really, why should we do what those guys said? They were a bunch of kind of plutocratic, racist jerks, so yeah. All I can say about that is yes, it's all not all myth, but it's a lot of it is myth, and it'll hold up for a long time until we need a critical. Until again, I think for substantive reasons, we need a critical reexamination. Now, I want to say what Bernie talked about, which I actually do talk about a little bit in the paper, and I think it is, while that is the odd case that it works that way, there are certainly experiences, and I mentioned the Caribbean constitutions in this case. The Caribbean constitutions were, when these countries became independent, were all kind of off-the-rack constitutions provided by the colonial office in London, and kind of, passed under the eyes of various colonial officials and said, yes, yes, yes. And but then as the countries began to kind of have their own experience of self-government, they say, this is a little embarrassing that, we have the Queen as the head of, who is this person? And the Queen is the head of state and Governor General and the Queen's picture on the stamp, so that even our Constitution is an order in council. Queen, not even an act of Parliament, mind you, it's an order of council. So that a lot of these countries have been essentially throw the Constitution, not because they're all that the same, and then the actual Constitution they have is, well, they change a little bit and they put in some nationalist references, but the form of government's pretty much the same. It's still a parliamentary system. I was just talking to a friend of mine who's now engaged in the rewriting of the Grenada Constitution, exactly for these reasons. They're not going to change too much, but it sticks in the craw that there is a that the origin of the Constitution is in a foreign country. And then, I can tell you other stories about this. The Irish Constitution also, again, there were substantive reasons to change the Irish Constitution also, but from 1922 to 1937, it was a continuing offense to a large portion of the Irish population that no matter how self-governing they in fact were, that their constitution was in form an act of the UK Parliament, and that was important. The Irish politics is still divided along those lines. So it does work that way, but I think that's the exceptional case. Usually it works the other way. Usually we examine the constituent authority when the substantive rules of the Constitution are disturbing.
Can I just say a word about Kurt's comment? I think that's right, although about cloaking and legitimacy, although I think if you look at that's, first of all, it's very judicially focused. Even with judges, you look at Blaisdell, they don't only focus on the past, they focus on the good consequences now, and certainly politicians do as well. And what I would suggest, again, is that there's a lot of myths. There's the myth that our Constitution is going to reach good consequences now, which people appeal to as a way of legitimating it, precisely for what Rick suggests. What's on most people's mind is our Constitution delivering for us today. And those are both important. And given that we've got a pretty good Constitution, people can reach into their myth bag as they choose, right? Maybe depending on their policy preferences, and not disturb the idea of the Constitution itself. And certainly now I think we have both of those in our tradition. I speak as someone who thinks originalism is better, but if we're just looking at it better as a positive matter, I don't think we should fool ourselves, even as originalists, that the sources of myths and myths that help with legitimacy are much broader than originalism, and are appealed to by politicians all the time when they start talking about constitutionalism and defending Roe and things of that sort. And I think that is something one needs to take account of as a positive matter, at least.
All right, we have a triad and 2/3 currently on the list, so we have 20 minutes. Be mindful of that. There are 5 of you now queued up. The next triad is John Harrison, Steve Smith, and Don Dripps.
If I see the structure,
it's that the constituent authority, we'll talk again about the United States, the constituent authority is located in the past. The right now, February 2011, Hardian process is not the constituent authority. There's a relationship between the right now process and the constituent authority, and that relationship tells us something about how the Constitution should be understood. Because, for example, if you think that the reason the right now process makes the Constitution law is because people right now thought the framers of the original Constitution were very wise, then that would have particular originalist, intentionalist, maybe consequences. And I want to assert just a claim about American politics right now, that there aren't enough people who think that to hold it up right now. That it's held up right now by coordination, and by the fact that for a whole lot of people today, whatever they think of the original process and most of the process, they think that by a combination of luck and some changes, say including the 15th and 19th Amendments, the Constitution we have right now is okay. But maybe the old one wasn't, and to the extent the old one was, lucky accident. And that those two factors, without those two factors, we wouldn't keep going with this one. There would be a major change. Is that empirically plausible, and B, if so, what implications does that have about the relationship between what's going on now and the constituent authority, and how that would then feed into how you would deal with the Constitution today?
Steve.
Okay, I've been trying to think about what you said about the implications of what you bring about constituent authority for interpretation, originalist interpretation. So you said if we accept the document as authoritative because it was the product of a constituent authority, then it would follow that we would want to understand it to mean what the constituent authority, intended it to mean, and that seems plausible, maybe arguable, but that seems to me quite plausible. So, but then it turns out that the constituent authority is kind of a mixture of historical fact or reality and contemporary construction or something. I mean, you use different terms for it, but we sort of have to construct it in a way, but we're not completely at liberty to just make up anything. What we make up is sort of based on what was historical fact and so on. So then, if we took your first point about interpreting the document in terms of what was intended by the constituent authority, and we also say that the constituent authority is this mixture of fact and fiction, would we look to, my first thought was, well, I guess then we'd try and interpret it according to this kind of partly fictional, the intentions of this partly fictional author. Maybe that's what we would try to do. And then even as an instance, I thought, so if the Supreme Court says, well, we should interpret the Establishment Clause basically to mean what Thomas Jefferson thought it meant, because he was, after all, so important in the making of the First Amendment, and
and it turns out, well, he wasn't actually important at all in the making of the First Amendment, but if that's the fiction that somehow, has developed, then maybe the court wasn't so far off with that. But then you start thinking about that and think, well, but that seems kind of weird. I mean, you can imagine Larry Alexander or Stanley Fish stepping in here and saying, so what, we're supposed to interpret it according to the intentions of some guy who had nothing to do with writing it? And so then I thought, well, maybe no. Maybe you go another way. Maybe you say the constituent authority, which is partly fact, partly fiction, gives the authority to the document. But when we try to figure out what it means, we only look to the historical part, so the people who actually did write it, even if, and now our partly myth of constituent authority, that isn't, quite what we think. But then that seems a little weird, because then you could end up sort of interpreting it to mean what was intended by people that we don't think of as authoritative, really, and we wouldn't respect it as authority based on their say-so. So I'm just sort of confused as to what you think what the implications of what. Actually, I liked a lot the paper and pretty much agreed with most of it about constituent authority. But what the implications would be for interpretation. If you could say a little more.
Don. The constituent authority, whether it's an occupying army or the will of the people, however we define that, is exercised sort of spasmodically in crisis. And so that's a situation where if we move down to assuming the constituent authority is the popular will in some sense, that's the situation where the constituent authority is not acquiescing in the actions of ordinary politics. Is there any significance for constitutional legitimacy of popular acquiescence in actions by the ordinary political branches, whether it's the court or the executive or Congress, just the fact of popular acquiescence, if the constituent authority is popular will, that is in effect an extra-textual amendment. And I think of, say, legal tender cases as a clear case. But if that's right, then what's to say that when is something properly characterized as a usurpation?
I'm having trouble with that. You may have to clarify somewhat for me, but I think it's sort of, I want to say one thing about what you said and what John said before also. Most people don't think about the authority of the Constitution. Almost all the people don't think about it almost all the time. So that the question is, there will be occasions, and they will be, I think, unusual occasions, when a significant number of people direct their attention to the legitimacy of the Constitution. They will do so, for reasons I've already mentioned, only when there is something significant at stake. And it may be that because of the subsequent amendments modification of the Constitution, it may be because of some misinterpretation of the Constitution by the Supreme Court over time, that the occasions for that reexamination don't arise. So that this paper is about rare historical moments. Rare both in terms of the creation of the Constitution and rare in terms of the examination of the creation of constitutions. So I think if, in fact, what John says about the change of the Constitution is by lucky accident turns out to be right, that may be a postponement of the time that John was talking about before, the case where we can postpone actual re-examination and going through the kind of painful process of reconsidering whether we have the Constitution we want. With regard to the last thing that Don said, again, I'm not sure I understand this issue about acquiescence. Again, I think there's a difference between acquiescence and the exertion of popular will. And as I said, even the exertion of popular will is very hard to figure out exactly when it happens and in what forms and so forth. But I think when people write about it anyway, acquiescence is never a candidate for the expression of popular will. It seems to me that for lawmaking power, the exercise of lawmaking power and the exercise of constitution-making power, something more affirmative is always attributed to the people than that. That's the thing that what Steve was talking about. I mean, I don't know. as I wrote the paper, this is one of those occasions when, as I wrote, I didn't know how it was going to end. And when I wrote the paper, I began to start asking myself the same kinds of questions that you are asking, and the result is the perhaps unsatisfactory conclusion of the paper. What I talked about here in my presentation, which really does not appear that clearly in the paper, is the possibility that this again is a problem more in theory than in fact, than in practice. In practice, one can in fact look at the actual historical events that create the Constitution and the actual human beings who wrote the Constitution. The reconstruction that I'm talking about, the kind of fictional myth aspects of it, are what do those events mean in terms of the expression of the will of the American people, say. And we can somehow say, yeah, Jefferson and Madison and Franklin and Cotton Mather and whoever else was there, they all essentially were embodying the will of the people for reasons which we need not examine too carefully. And that might be sufficient to take care of what would otherwise be the dubious legitimacy of the constituent authority.
All right, we have a dyad probably to conclude on. Stanley Fish and Mike Paulson.
Well, in latter stages of the discussion, I kept thinking of the man who shot Liberty Valance. Print the legend. But I think it's been a very clarifying discussion, first because of an excellent paper, an excellent commentary, and great questions, starting with Larry Solom's. And I was going to just not challenge anyone, but try to sum up some things for myself and perhaps for you too. When Rick mused about there possibly being a crummy process that creates a good Constitution, I had two thoughts. First thought is, what happens then? And I'm thinking about the situation in Egypt. We've been talking to one another for some hours so that I've lost contact, as you may have too, with that situation.
Still
but
there.
Something might happen. And then what's going to happen? And what will happen is that there will be some retroactively constituted myth, the word that has been used so many times, and that retroactively constituted myth will not have an entire absence of relationship to what actually happened, but will be in some sense a myth made up of the best hopes, wishes, and aspirations of those who engaged in that very messy process. And at that point, we will have the original dramatic moment that Kurt spoke of, and it will turn out in good Derridian fashion, I apologize for that the original dramatic moment will have come second. And so the original dramatic moment will have come second, and will be a moment that takes, and this goes back to some things that Heidi said in her paper, because of success having occurred, and then the myth will then continue and be legitimizing and authorizing. And what that suggests, to me at least, in connection with John's response to Rick's paper and also Steve's question, is that part of the myth will be the myth of originalism. So that originalism becomes a necessary myth and a necessary component of constituent authority. But I don't think I'm saying anything new. I think that's kind of the way in which the conversation was going.
Mike?
I like the paper and the discussion of 5 quick contentious points. Okay, just sort of, which I think end up challenging the relation of this to originalism. First of all, it strikes me that there's no a priori reason why we today should be thought bound by the Constitution. It may be a worthy Constitution. That's up for us to evaluate. The fact that it came from a specific historical process That doesn't weigh much with me. It seems like a form of ancestor worship. I think the real question is this a good Constitution? Second point, that strikes me as an entirely different question from the meaning of the Constitution. Before I can decide whether it's a good Constitution, I first interpret it. Interpretation seems completely different from authority. Interpretation seems completely different from my subsequent evaluation. When I decide whether I wish to be bound by this Constitution, I read it, try to understand what it says, and decide if it's a good one. Okay. Third, sort of back to authority. If I've agreed to exercise power under this Constitution, if I've sworn an oath to uphold it, or taken office under it, and maybe to some extent agreed to be governed by it, then maybe I am bound. But that's a different decision. I've agreed to exercise power under the Constitution, and therefore I should exercise it in accordance with its terms. Fourth, and this is more directed at John and perhaps Mike Rappaport, is it seems to me that the political theory question is that what makes any sort of system of government legitimate is simple majoritarianism, aggregated in some sort of reliable way. I think, as Lincoln put it, a deliberate majority, always changing, always subject to change, is the only true sovereign of a free people. Okay. And fifth point, and I guess it's also directed to John, I agree that there are high costs to revolution, but the difficulty of upending a Constitution does nothing to affect the proper interpretation of the Constitution, or necessarily even the legitimacy of the Constitution in the first place. It's just a practical evaluation that, too many eggs broken to make a new omelet.
Just add in, I hate to end on a prime number, so I'll just try to make it visible like 3 here. And what would really test a lot of things is if the Supreme Court, let's say, in dealing with the birthright citizenship issue, said, we are sure what the intended meaning is here. It was to grant citizenship to anyone born in the territory other than certain Indians and diplomats, but it covers the children of illegal aliens. But that's what it means. That was what the authorial meaning was. But it's a crummy policy. Hardly any other nation actually has that policy. So we're just going to say there is no such thing as birthright citizenship. Now that would put on the table in a sort of nice, dramatic way, whether, because I take it that would be reflecting most what sort of popular policy sentiment would be, and then we'd have a nice test as to what it is we accept as fundamental law in this kind. The Supreme Court never does something like that for reasons that I think are instructive, but that would be.
They don't do that. As I said, they don't do that, and it does. It tells you. I think Bork said 100 years ago how somebody advertises tells you what they want to sell. And so in fact, but of course they do in fact come close to doing that every day, but it's done with a kind of a fig leaf of reference to the Constitution. I'm sorry. Mike, I don't know what number 5 was, but a lot of what you talked about had to do with, especially points 3, 1, 2, and 3, had to do with why one should pay it. Why one should feel bound by the Constitution at all, and I think one has to look at 2 different levels. At the level of the Constitution being in place as law, then one is bound to submit to the Constitution for the same reason one is bound to obey law at all. So for whatever reasons there are for doing that, they which are not, of course, absolute reasons, then that is equally true in the case of the Constitution. As to the question of why we should treat the Constitution as law, right? That's something which itself is not an issue of law. And for that, one has to have political, moral, other kinds of reasons. You said that you said the meaning. There's one thing is why the Constitution is law, and the other thing is what the meaning of the Constitution is. And those are two different subjects, two different topics. I agree they are two different things, but I do not think they are perfectly separate. That is, to the extent that we are interested in the meaning of the Constitution, we are interested in it for the reason that we think it is authoritative and binding, and then we have to ask, why is it authoritative and binding on us? And in doing that, we're going to have to take ourselves back to those original questions, I think. And I'm sorry that I've no doubt left out some of your questions. I'm sure John will remember them. I do want to say in terms of what Stanley said, I think he absolutely summed this up accurately. And that his point about the priority of things, indeed, at the very end of the paper, I'm sure people didn't see it, but there's a footnote from Hans, an article by Hans Lindahl, in which he says something very similar. He says, constitutions come first, constituent authority comes second. And I think that's certainly true.
Thank you. We're out of time. Thank you, guys.